So reacting to every key press and updating and storing the current value of the text field in some variable is one way of handling and storing the user input. But of course, it can be a bit cumbersome to manually store all the input for all the text fields that might make up your user interface. And that's why Flutter gives you a convenient alternative. Nonetheless, it's also important to know about this approach because it's also a valid approach that you might see in many projects you're working on. But the alternative you get does not require you to add this function and this extra storage variable. Instead, we'll add another property, which can be a final property now, to this new expense state class. And this is a property that could be called TextEditingController. Now the name might be a bit strange, and of course it is up to you, but I chose TextEditingController here because the value which will be stored in this property will be an object that is created with help of the built-in TextEditingController class, which is a class provided by Flutter. Now this creates an object that's optimized for handling user input, you could say. An object that can be passed as a value to text field to let Flutter do all the heavy lifting of storing the entered value and so on. Now when using TextEditingController, there's one thing that's really important to keep in mind though. When you create a text editing controller here, you also have to tell Flutter to delete that controller when the widget is not needed anymore. So for example, when the modal overlay is closed. Because otherwise, this text editing controller which you create here would live on in memory even though the widget is not visible anymore. That's why when using TextEditingController, you should also always add the special dispose method to your state class here. So a method called dispose, which returns nothing and calls superDispose. And before calling superDispose, you should reach out to your controller and on that controller call the dispose method. So that you tell Flutter that this controller is not needed anymore. Otherwise, it will not be deleted, and ultimately your device memory might be taken up by all these unnecessary controllers, and that could cause your app to crash. So therefore, you should always dispose of these text editing controllers you might be creating. But what's the idea behind this controller now? Well, with it created, you can go to your text field and get rid of this onChanged parameter, which you now don't need anymore. And instead you can set a controller parameter, and you set that to the controller that should be responsible for this text field. So if you have multiple fields, you need multiple controllers. And you can now also use this title controller here in the function that's triggered when this button is pressed. Here, you can access your title controller, and then on that object, you will have a text property, which, as you might guess, simply contains the text the user entered into the input field. And therefore, you don't have to manually take care about storing that input, instead Flutter does it for you. And with that, of course, if we go back and reopen this and enter test, or test2, and click save expense, and we go back to that debug console, we now see that output here in the console. And that's therefore the approach we'll use in this section now. And therefore, since it's a bit less work to do, and we will add more text fields, and I don't want to manually manage all the inputs, I will use this controller approach in this section here.